Welcome to Pedo Teeth Talk, brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, a podcast show that delivers cutting-edge ideas for the professionals specializing in pediatric dentistry.
Thank you for tuning in to Pedo Teeth Talk, where we bring you the contemporary issues important to you and your practice, brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. I'm your host, Joel Berg, and thank you to our Pedo Teeth Talk sponsor, Hugh Freedy, for helping us bring you great content. We couldn't do this without them. Visit them at www.hughfreedy.com. That's HU-FRIEDY.com. We're here today with Dr. Michael Rich. Dr. Rich, MD, MPH, is the founder and director of the Center on Media and Child Health and the first evidence-based medical program addressing physical, mental, and social health issues associated with digital technology, the Clinic for Interactive Media and Internet Disorders. As the Mediatrician, and we'll hear in a minute what that means, Dr. Rich offers research-based, balanced, and practical answers to questions about children's media use and the positive and negative implications for their health and development. Dr. Rich, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So glad you're here. Just to tell our listeners to get this conversation going, and I know that our conversation will give us that answer, but just tell us at the start, what's a mediatrician?
A mediatrician is a pediatrician who is aware of the media environment in which his patients and actually all kids are growing up, living, and learning.
I see. So, when I think of this, and when I first talked to you, I imagine all kinds of things that you do, and I know that you practice as a mediatrician as well with patient encounters. And we talked about the idea of anticipatory guidance. So, before we get into some of the specifics of the kind of identification or diagnoses that you do, if you will, and treatments, I think just to cut to the chase, I think in the realm of anticipatory guidance, a lot of your work can help prevent some of the negative outcomes and encourage some of the positive things. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Absolutely. Today's kids are growing up in an entirely different environment than their parents or their clinicians or their teachers did. What we have come to realize is that we are actually following three relatively rapidly moving targets here. The first being the developing infant to child to adolescent to adult, something that we've known about and do know about, but that is happening now in an environment that is rapidly evolving, both as a reflection of them growing up in terms of what they're using, but also strongly influencing the way they grow up, the choices they make, the activities they pursue. And finally, all of our behavior has really been transformed by the fact that we have smartphones in our pockets, we have screens all around us. And I think we need to take the same level of observation, the same level of evidence-based response to it, both in terms of recognizing that these kids are affected, their health is affected, their development is affected, but also to understand it well enough to help parents anticipate what comes next for their infant, for their 2-year-old, for their teenager, so that they are prepared to parent them in the digital domain the same way they parent in the physical domain.
So when we talk about the use of media and identification of the problems that may be associated and also the opportunities, the positive things, is it synonymous to say the use of a smartphone? Is that the same thing as saying the use of media? Are we talking about TV and how do you break that down in terms of what kind of devices we're talking about?
Well, media is anything that communicates something from one human or to another or to many humans. So it is not only smartphones, it is also, video games, it's television, it's movies, it's music, it's books. But, what's front and center for all of us in terms of our kids' changed behavior, our kids' exposures, is really smartphones now because they're in their pockets. They're around them all the time. And one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is anything we talk about today may be obsolete a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. So we really are dealing with a rapidly changing environment. And that's one of the reasons that I have a podcast and an online advice column called Ask the Mediatrician, where parents can present their questions, present the dilemmas they're facing, and we can answer them in ways that are balanced, that are based in science, not in opinions or preconceptions or values, and in ways that parents can do right now, today, without buying a device or taking a course.
So, Michael, when I hear you say that your parents are calling in and asking questions, I can imagine all kinds of questions, one of which would be screen time. A lot of the devices, keep track of screen time. Do you recommend setting screen time limits for children?
Interestingly, I think that the concept of screen time limits is an obsolete one in a world in which we have so many screens available to us, essentially 24/7 and wall-to-wall in our environment. That does not mean we shouldn't limit screen time. What I mean by that is that, as we were evolving in our relationship to screens as those who take care of kids, the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, recommended 1 to 2 hours of quality educational screen time a day in the days of television, when that was the only screen in our lives. That was a problem, however, because first of all, parents didn't want to be or didn't feel they could limit their children, but also that it laid it on them to understand what was quality and what was educational. And of course, all of those who were marketing content knew that if they could slap an educational label on it, that would sell. Now, just because screen time limits are literally impossible to measure. I mean, I research this stuff and I can't tell you how much screen time I have every day. And that we should not think of it as limiting, as screen time limits so much as limiting screen time. And what I mean by that is that the whole point of screen time really is, what is it displacing? What are we not doing because we're in front of a screen? And so we should be conscious about seeing these screens, whether they be a smartphone or a computer or a television, as tools, very powerful tools that we are using to do certain tasks, but not to use them as a default for whatever we happen to be doing. We have fallen into a bad habit of pulling out our phones and staring at them at every moment and any moment. We can't get into an elevator without looking at our phones. We can't get on a bus without staring at our phones. And we are not looking at each other. We are not interacting with each other. And most importantly, for parents, we're not present for our kids if we or they or both are staring at our phones.
So I imagine the parental screen use matters. Is that right? I mean, you kind of have to counsel the parents, not just the child.
Absolutely. Kids hear about 1% of what we say, but 100% of what we do. And so it is not only that parents are modeling behavior for their kids, and kids are always looking to what can I do to grow up? How can I be adult? How can I get the kind of freedom that I imagine that parents have? And so if the parents are staring at their phones all the time, the kids are going to do it too. And interestingly, the parents will say, turn off that phone. That's just drivel. What I'm doing is important. It's an email from my boss or whatever. And so there's a double standard around that, which of course encourages kids just to hack the system. So I think that we have to be very conscious that our behavior is not only emulated by our kids, but that it cuts us off from our kids. And so one of the things I say is, instead of trying to develop killer apps, we should be developing our killer bees. Those bees are, be balanced in our media use as well as other activities. Be mindful in our media use in terms of, let's use these tools for what they're good at, but turn them off and put them away when they're not as good. And above all, particularly with children, be present. Be present with them, because if we're checking out CNN or looking at the latest meme or social media or whatever, we are not present for our children. And ultimately, that's what they want more than anything else. When I ask my patients what their parents could do better, invariably, the first thing out of their mouths is pay more attention to me.
Yeah, it sounds like this modeling behavior is a big part of this, that if the parent is saying or implying that what I'm doing is important, but you don't be on the screen, that's a mixed message, as you said, but they're going to model that. And what they really want, that's what a wonderful message. What they really want is the attention of the parent and the presence of the parent.
Yeah, and interaction with them. Why did we have these kids anyway if we're not going to interact with them?
Yeah, so is there a best guide to guiding the child's screen use? Is there a good way if it's not about time? What would be an effective method to guide their use?
Well, here's what we think the research shows and what has played itself out well in my clinical practice around this, which is that we upend the paradigm from limiting screen time, which makes screen time the forbidden fruit, the thing that kids want all the more. And think of their 24-hour-a-day with them as an empty glass that you fill up with this many hours of sleep that you need at this stage of your life. A sit-down family meal every day without devices, the single most protective thing you can do, not only for their nutrition, but for their mental health and for their oral health, for that matter. And I think that also you put aside time for them to do something physical. They like shooting hoops. Put some time aside for that. Put time aside for the homework that they need to do, and then see what time is left. And you're doing a number of things here. Number one is by doing it with your child, they have ownership of this plan. They are on the same side as you. You are not the police officer, but they are learning to prioritize what they care about, what they do. They are learning to manage time, which God knows we could all do well. And they are learning to share their media environment with you because, frankly, they're doing it anyway. And one of the biggest problems with smartphones in particular is that it makes our interaction with this information that's coming at us an isolating and isolated event. It's not something that's shared in the way that we used to share going to the movies or even watching television in the living room. And that's the other piece of it is when you use media, use it with your kids. Use it with them, not only to model healthier, more balanced, more mindful use of media, but as an experience you share together, as a way of helping them see what they're seeing and placing it in context for them. Because when they are using screens alone, they run across things that upset them, confuse them, that they don't fully understand. And if you are there with them, I'm not saying to do this 24/7. I'm talking about doing this as a social event as much as one can. And when you're there with them, you can help them understand what's going on. This is also a great way to deal with things that you may not want them to be doing so much. Say they're playing Grand Theft Auto. Instead of wagging your finger at them and saying, I hate that, turn it off, and being the police officer, sit down next to them, play the game with them. First of all, you'll shock the hell out of them that you're doing it. Second of all, they will beat your pants off. But what you're doing is you're saying, I love you, I respect you, I want to know what brings you to this, why you enjoy this. And then when you've been schooled by them thoroughly and you finally learn how to steal automobiles, you can say with your mature prefrontal cortex and your mature, executive functions, you can say, okay, I finally figured out how to steal cars. Let's talk a little bit about why you might want to do that and rehearse it over and over and over again, and have them think a little bit about the implications of what they are learning and what they are habituating themselves to. Because ultimately, Sesame Street aside, all media are educational. What differs is what they teach and how well they teach it. Interesting.
So you're teaching them, and that's wonderful information for all of us. we're teaching them about the concept of budgeting time, and I imagine that's going to make them better developed in terms of budgeting everything, in terms of prioritization. And I love what you said about, this shouldn't be the default is to go to the phone. And you're saying, let's take care of ourselves. Let's do what we need to do for each other, for our own well-being, and then we can talk about what's left.
Absolutely.
So given that, should every young child or infant or toddler be using screens? Are there some situations where it's not even necessary at all, maybe?
Well, I think there are many situations where it's not necessary at all. I remember when the American Academy of Pediatrics came up with the recommendation of 1 to 2 hours of screen time a day, and under the age of 2, no screen time. And parents were up in arms saying, how am I supposed to get dinner on the table if I can't park my kid in front of a television? Which sort of begs the question of how we as a species survived without eating dinner until 1947. But that being said, I think that we don't think of the fact that what else they could do, including coming into the kitchen with us and banging around pots and pans and throwing flour around, might be actually a richer brain development experience than watching whatever happens to be on the screen. So we think of the screens as electronic babysitters or as distractors to keep the kids quiet, rather than as the immensely powerful tools they are for good or for not so good. And so I think that that's a really important way of approaching it, which is that this time is valuable. Their attention is valuable. And we teach our kids from very early on that their attention is a value to everyone, and it should be a value to them. In other words, advertisers spend billions of dollars to grab their attention and hold their attention. And we sort of give it away without thinking, much the way we give our personal data away without thinking. And this is about helping the child use media at an age when, first of all, she or he needs it for school, even for entertainment or for fun, but also when she or he is able to understand that process, that transaction well enough to take care of themselves in that context.
This is fantastic. And it all gets back to being present. It seems like the theme here is the parents being present and teaching that idea and demoing it, and not going away themselves into this screen space, but
Absolutely.
Demoing to the child, role modeling to the child is such a big part, I'm hearing.
Yes, absolutely.
We will pause now for a word from our sponsor.
Hugh Freedy is the global leader in dental instrument manufacturing, offering pediatric restorative solutions that keep you performing at your best. For more information on Hugh Freedy products, visit www.hughfreedy.com/AAPD crowns.
We are back with Dr. Michael Rich, the Mediatrician. Michael, this is amazing information that all of us can use as providers and also as parents, and also as we interact with children as patients to understand the impact of media and screen use on them as we encounter them in our practices. So I want to shift gears now and talk about social media. That's a gigantic subject. We don't have a lot of time to cover it fully, but there are some good things about social media. We hear a lot about, it's not good for you, it's too much, it's impairing our friendships and relationships. But when should kids get on social media in terms of age and in what circumstances?
Well, one thing parents should be aware of, which most parents appear not to be, is that there is actually a federal law, the Childhood Online Privacy Protection Act, that says that kids under the age of 13 shouldn't be using social media at all. And then that brings up the question of what is social media? People don't think of YouTube as social media. They think of it as a broadcast system. It actually is social media, and there's interactivity on it. Now, I'll be the first to say that many, many, many millions of kids are on social media, particularly things like YouTube, much earlier than age 13. And that is, as the movie ratings, a relatively arbitrary line in the sand that was drawn by politicians and it was negotiated to. It is not based on developmental science. And so my take on this is, when does the child need social media? For example, many coaches, sports coaches, use social media as a way of scheduling practices and communicating with their players. Teachers use it as well. So when is it needed, and when is the child physically, mentally, and socially prepared for the implications of it? And what I mean by that is that the so-called dangers of social media, these scare stories that kids on social media are more anxious, more depressed, more suicidal. That may well be so, but it is not the social media that does it to the kids. It is the way the kids are using social media that matters. What I mean by that is that we are not using social media to be authentic with each other. We are using social media to market ourselves to each other, much the way the companies market themselves. We are showing the great vacation I went on, or the hot new boyfriend I have, or the outfit I just bought. And so what happens is, when others come to that, they feel like everyone in the world is happier than they are.
Right.
Because they know in and of themselves how they feel. And so I, being a pediatrician, am an eternal optimist. And I believe that if we can learn to use social media to be true, to be authentic with each other, to do what we do with real friends, which is to show our vulnerabilities, show our need for each other, for our interrelationship with each other, that this can actually be an instrument of peace. Because it will allow us to understand each other. It'll allow kids in the U.S. and Iran to be on social media together. And then when their political leaders say those are the enemy, they'll say, no, they're not. In fact, I know that kid better than I know you. Why should I take up arms against him? So
right.
I think. Do you
think that people are onto it? That people are, this thing you said, which is so true. We all recognize that people are marketing themselves. They only show positive things, and look at the vacation I went on, and look at my hot girlfriend, as you said. People are kind of onto that it's not a real world, and has it turned the corner in that sense, and people kind of get it for what it is?
Some people do, others do not. And even among those who do, the kind of reflexive response is to shut it down, to turn it off, rather than to be aware of it, to be conscious of it, and to redirect how we use it to make it a more powerful, more human tool. I think we lost a lot when friend became a verb, right? Yeah. That it's a very different thing to friend hundreds of people than it is to have friends.
Yes. To be a good friend, and I think the meaning of friendship, you're right, that's a good way to characterize it, when it became a verb everywhere. So let's talk a little bit about some of the damaging effects, just for a moment, of not protecting our kids, from things like cyberbullying and sexting. What can parents do to protect their kids from those kinds of negative things?
Well, I think that we need to also shift our attitude about parenting in the digital space from parental controls, which all of the companies are, trumpeting as the solution, and think about parental engagement instead. No kid wants to be controlled. When you talk about controls, they immediately start to think about how they can subvert them. What are their workarounds? How can they get away with stuff? And so this goes back to my idea of using media with kids, so that when a child wants to get on social media, when a child wants to get a smartphone, sit down with the child and work through what they're going to use that tool for, what they're not going to use it for, what the consequences should be if they misuse it, which they will, and also what their protection, what their safety zone is, so that what you're dealing with is a transparent and open relationship with your children around their use. And I'm going to say something that kids hate, but I think parents should not only be involved with their kids, as in be connected with them by social media, but they should have their kids' passwords. They should be able to get into their kids' devices at any time, not because parents are going to obsessively monitor their kids 24/7, but because if they can, it will have the same self-regulatory effect that, for example, random drug testing has in the workplace, which is just because the kid knows mom or dad can get into it, they're going to behave differently. And in fact, what I say to the kids is their rule for anything they either receive or, more importantly, send online is what I call the grandma rule, right? Which is, don't put anything online that you don't want grandma to see, because she can get to it. Yes. And so, I think that we have to recognize that kids, as desperately as they want privacy, simply are not neurodevelopmentally ready or able to understand privacy in the way they need to in regards to the digital footprint they're building. And so to a 13-year-old, privacy means only so mom and dad can't see it. They don't think of anything else.
So let me shift gears. I want to talk about addiction, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to cover that. Can a child, we hear people talk about this, but do you think a child can get addicted to gaming, for example, which is one aspect of use of screens? It's probably one of the biggest.
Right. Yeah. Well, I have a whole clinic for interactive media and internet disorders that deals with this. The DSM-5, the psychiatric manual, says internet gaming disorder is something that should be researched in terms of a possible diagnosis. The ICD-11, the WHO's International Classification of Diseases, has named gaming disorder as a diagnosis. However, first of all, I don't think it's an addiction. It doesn't meet medical criteria or biological criteria for an addiction, as in physiologic change that can be measured when using and especially when withdrawing. The word addiction is such a lightning rod. It gets plenty of attention, but it makes parents say, my kid's not like a junkie or a bum on Skid Row. He's just kind of a pain in the butt. And what that means is that they don't come to care, or they don't seek advice very early in the process, when it's much easier to redirect. Not only that, but as you'll notice from the two designations from both the American Psychiatric Association and the World Health Organization, they're talking about gaming. What we are seeing in our clinic is actually 4 kinds of problems with interactive media: gaming, predominantly boys; social media, predominantly girls; pornography, evenly balanced pretty much between the sexes; and what we're calling information binging, which is the endless YouTube or Twitch videos that kids will watch. And now, when does that become a problem? It becomes a problem when it impairs the child in their life, in their academic performance, in their sleep, in their
This is how parents would identify it. This is how a parent would identify it. It's a problem, is when they start to see these things. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. When they start to see these behaviors change, when they start withdrawing. We actually call this problematic interactive media use. And that is not only because we are getting away from the term addiction, but also because we're not naming the technology as the problem. We're not saying video game addiction. We're not saying smartphone addiction. We're saying things like, this is a problem with our behavior with these devices and with these applications. And I think that ultimately, what we're seeing, quite honestly, is not a new diagnosis, but a manifestation of diagnoses we already know. The kids who are into gaming often have an underlying either subclinical or previously known but undertreated attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Kids who have problems with social media are often anxious. They're often kids who are prone to anxiety anyway. And so what we often do is we will drill down and find basically the primary lesion, the primary problem that is playing itself out in this very new environment of interactive media.
That's fantastic. And just in our last moment here, one last question, and I could go on for hours, and I hope, Dr. Rich, I can get you back sometime. But I'll encourage our audience in the meantime to go to your podcast, because I know there's a wonderful amount of information and interactions with parents. So I urge everybody to do that, to take a look there.
It's called Ask the Mediatrician.
Ask the Mediatrician, okay.
Yeah.
So the last thing very quickly would be going back to anticipatory guidance. You mentioned, in the midst of all the things that a primary care physician, pediatrician specifically, would do during a well baby checkup, you've said you've now added this to the repertoire of interactive things in terms of anticipatory guidance to hopefully prevent some of the issues that you've seen. Is that correct? And if so, what briefly can we do there?
I think briefly, what we're doing is not adding it on as another question, but recognizing from the get-go that kids are living in a media-saturated environment, a screen-saturated environment. So, in fact, it sort of colors everything that we ask about when we ask about activity, when we ask about nutrition, because there's a whole difference between eating a meal with a family around a table and eating in front of a television or in front of a computer. And so I think rather than saying this is an add-on, for the new age, let's just take a step back and bring the awareness that this is the air they breathe and the water they drink. This is the environment they're growing up in, and have that affect every bit of guidance, every question that we ask them.
That's great advice. And wow, I thank you so much. We've gotten so much great information. And I'm going to go back and listen to this podcast myself several times. And I'm going to follow your podcast. And I urge our audience to do so, because this is valuable to us as providers, as pediatric dentists, and also as parents, and just interacting with kids in general and understanding what's going on out there. So thank you, Dr. Rich, so much for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for enjoying this time with me.
And thank you to our audience for tuning into Pedo Teeth Talk, where we bring you the contemporary issues important to you and your practice, brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. We'll see you here next time.
Be sure to attend AAPD's annual session this May. Every year, AAPD brings together the experts in pediatric dentistry and more to provide 3 days of the best continuing education, networking, socializing, and exhibits. Visit annual.aapd.org for more information.
Pedo Teeth Talk is brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, the show that delivers cutting-edge ideas for the professional specializing in pediatric dentistry. If you have any questions or comments, please email info@aapd.org. We welcome your ideas for future shows and guests. For more information on the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, visit aapd.org.